It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Andrew Macintosh. Andrew is the Associate Dean for Research at the ANU College of Law and a leader in the fields of environmental law and policy. His work is cross-disciplinary, involving legal, economic, and political science methodologies. Climate change mitigation and adaptation are central pillars of his research, with special attention to carbon offsets, land sector carbon abatement, and federal environmental law. Andrew's work has a strong policy orientation and he regularly advises governments and corporations. He's currently the chair of the Australian Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, a director of the Port of Newcastle, which is a bit old, that one. Okay, all right, no longer true. Still of interest, yeah.
Certainly not currently the chair.
I wanted to throw it in there because I don't normally get to say something like that. Member of the Australian Government's Emission Reduction Fund Reference Group. Is that still true? Not anymore. Okay. Well, I'm going to stop saying all that stuff because it's not true anymore.
Stuff lives over the corridor.
Okay. All right. Either way, I've been looking forward to today's talk a lot because it's something of high interest to me, but I know nothing about. So I'm very pleased to hand you over to Andrew, and he's going to tell us about Australian climate policy and carbon offsets, corruption or misunderstanding.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Sorry.
Yeah, what I wanted to do is just firstly take you through some real basics about carbon offsets. Then after that, take you through some basics about the safeguard mechanism. What is our carbon pricing scheme? That's really important to understand why carbon offsets are important and why the integrity of carbon offsets is important. And then take you to some details about how the carbon offset scheme is or isn't working, and hopefully open it up to you to make your decision on whether we're barking mad or whether there are truly severe and significant problems with the scheme. So really basic stuff for people who don't play in the carbon offset game. It's really relatively simple. You've got party A who undertakes a project that reduces emissions, net emissions relative to a baseline. So think, for example, of Mugga Lane. If you live in Canberra, Mugga Lane is an offset site. It's got 4 generators on it down there. They capture the methane that comes out of the landfill site, feed it through the 4 generators, that combusts it, converts it to CO2, thereby reducing its warming impact. Mugga Lane gets credits for that. They're tradable credits. Those credits can be sold to anyone really, but the 2 primary markets are, one, voluntary buyers who want to claim that they're carbon neutral. So your Woolworths or anybody else, any other company that wants to claim they're carbon neutral can buy one of these credits and thereby claim that they've neutralized their impact. The other buyer is the primary buyer, which is those entities that are covered by the safeguard mechanism. Those entities have a legal obligation to keep their emissions within a cap, a limit, and if they exceed that limit, they can get around that by buying offsets. That's how the system works. Now, there's often a lot of confusing about what is the role of offsets. From a policy perspective, offsets have one primary function, and that is to reduce the costs of mitigating emissions. It's not anything else. That is the primary function. Their function is to make it cheaper for us to achieve our targets. And this can be shown in a very simple graph that any economic student has seen a million times, but very quickly for those who haven't seen it, start from here to here. We got polluter A. Polluter A is trying to reduce their emissions, and we've given them the obligation to reduce their emissions by 10 tonnes, 0 to 10. This here is their mitigation abatement cost curve. So each unit up here represents the additional cost of mitigating that unit. So therefore, if this one polluter is required to reduce their emissions by 10 units, the area under the curve, X and Y, is the total cost. Now, what have we said to the polluter? That you don't have to reduce your emissions on your own. You can pay somebody else to reduce their emissions. Okay, then let's add this potential offset entity and do the same thing again. So they can reduce 1 tonne at this cost, etc., all the way through. If we then say, okay, you two can trade to work out what's the cheapest way of doing things, from basic logic, what you'd expect is we start over here. Y starts off being the one with the obligation to reduce their emissions. The B is optional. A says to B, hey, how about I pay you money in order to reduce your emissions? And A can pay that difference and still come out better. So what you should see is the two should trade, and ultimately they should stop here, at which point it's cheaper for A to reduce their emissions than it is for B to reduce theirs. So that reduces the total cost from X and Y simply to X. Simple, not overly difficult. That's how it's meant to work in practice. Now, that all rests on a bunch of assumptions, namely that B, when they're saying they're reducing emissions, they're actually reducing emissions. So when they say that they're sequestering carbon in a tree, that there's actually a tree that's sequestering carbon. When they say that they're combusting methane down at Mugger Lane, that they're actually combusting the methane. B, that abatement's got to be additional. That is, the realisation of that abatement must be dependent on the accessing the carbon credits. In the absence of the carbon credits, if they're going to do it anyway, then there is no benefit for the climate. The final one is if you were sequestering carbon in a tree or soils or debris or anything else, then the sequestration has to be permanent. So it must remain there. There's debates about how long that needs to be, and I won't get into that here, but it's a live one, an interesting one. The problem with offset schemes, both domestically and globally, and it really doesn't matter when you talk about biodiversity or carbon, they hit the reality is that they very rarely do. When almost any independent analysis has been done on any carbon offset scheme, they've come up short, and I don't mean a bit short. Anyone who plays in this space accepts that in the reality of doing policy, you're going to miss. We always talk about an 80-20 rule. What you want to make sure is that 80% of the time, you're getting that, real, additional and permanent abatement, and 20% of the time, maybe, maybe not, but we can live with that error. But the problem is that the evidence suggests that that's often inverted, that it's much more likely to be 80% rubbish and 20% real. That's problematic. Now, what happens then? So if things are wrong, if we're handing out invalid credits, what are the consequences? Well, firstly, it makes global warming worse. So think about that case where you've got an emitter who's got caps on their emissions. They're allowed, those permits allow them to increase their emissions above the caps. So if there's no offsetting reduction, then we've made things worse. Secondly, buyers of carbon credits can be misled, right? A lot of them are buying them for legitimate reasons. They're expecting to get abatement, and when the abatement's not there, they have been ripped off. Thirdly, when these entities go out and say that they've made their emissions, they are carbon neutral, they often make claims to their consumers. So if you look around now, you can see carbon neutral beef, carbon neutral bench tops, carbon neutral handrails, carbon neutral, you name it, there's carbon neutral almost anything. And some of us go out there and we buy our goods and services influenced by those claims. If the claims are false, people have been misled. Now, some people don't really care about that sort of stuff, but in the end, I do sit in a law school and I do care about people being defrauded, and that's fraud. But in terms of climate policy, the thing that really matters is this, the safeguard mechanism. I'm going to be really quick here because I don't have a lot of time. But when it was first introduced back in 2014, it was a regulatory mechanism that was meant to stop emissions increasing at our largest emitting facilities. So these facilities, they emit more than 100,000 tons of CO2 a year, CO2e that is, a year. And the idea under the coalition government was we have this safeguard mechanism that really stops them going up, at least going up too far. When the Albanese government came in, they made changes to the safeguard mechanism. That has shifted it much more into an emissions trading scheme. People don't like saying that, but it is true. It's simply just an emissions trading scheme that is based on emissions intensity. The idea is that no longer will the caps be there just to stop increases. They'll be driving down emissions. So those caps drop through time. The idea up here, so applies to facilities that emit over 100,000 tonnes. There's about 220 of them. And those caps are going to fall by about 4.5% per year. There's concessions for our trade exposed industries, but that's the general rule, 4.5% decline per year. And that they can meet those caps by either cutting on-site emissions or buying ACCUs, the carbon credits, or they can buy safeguard mechanism credits. The safeguard mechanism credits are classic baseline and credit stuff. So you've got some facilities in a particular subsector where their emissions above the baseline, some are below. Those who are below can sell the difference. Those who are above have to buy. It basically works like the better performers, sorry, the poorer performers subsidizing the better performers. If that makes sense. I won't bore you with those details. In terms of the breakdown of facilities, that provides the breakdown there. So what you get very clearly is that most of the facilities that are covered by the safeguard mechanism are, unsurprisingly, oil and gas, coal and other mining. They dominate the scheme, over 60%, I think, last time I calculated. Then you've got a smattering of other industries like fertilizer, think Intertech Pivot. You've got large transport operators. Note here, electricity generation is largely not in. So they deliberately excluded most electricity generation. So grid-connected electricity generation is out. These are smaller generators and generators that are not grid-connected, particularly those that are linked straight to industry. In terms of what the outcome is meant to be, this shows the projection of what this safeguard mechanism is meant to do through to 2030. And that is take emissions from those 220 facilities, which currently emit around 144 million tonnes per year, and drive that down to around 95 or so. That's the plan. The Greens, as part of this, negotiated absolute caps on emissions, which my personal opinion are just political. They don't really make any difference, and they won't make any difference. As soon as you apply any sort of carbon price to these facilities, they will reduce their emissions, and as a consequence, it's just very unlikely that the covered facilities would hit those caps. Now, a couple of things just to note that leads us into the importance of the offsets is that, as you'll see from this list, the types of industries we're dealing with, a lot of these don't have many readily available cheap abatement opportunities. Their abatement costs are very high. And think back to that graph I showed you before with that. Their abatement costs are very high. They're looking for someone else to do the abatement. So that's telling you they're automatically going to be thinking about offsets because they have to. If your abatement costs are $100, $150 a tonne, and you can buy an offset for $30, what are you going to do? You're going to buy the offset almost every time. It's not always true. There are opportunities, and we're seeing in some places some really exciting things happening. So gold mines going fully electric, and I've been recently having discussions with some of them. It's really positive to see some of the things that are happening. But it is true that in the short term to medium term, they have to rely heavily on offsets. Even entities like Fortescue, who say very clearly they do not like offsetting, but they can't deploy their mitigation measures in time. They're capital intensive. That takes a lot of time to get the capital, that it takes a lot of time to build them. So there's a significant interim period where they must rely on offsets. So we're very much dependent on the offset scheme, and we want to make sure that the offsets have credibility. Now, if you look at the legislation that governs this scheme, it kind of looks okay. They've got high-level requirements, high-level standards for the methods that dictate that the methods must meet offsets integrity standards. They've got project-level requirements that dictate that the projects must be new. They mustn't be supported by other government programs. They mustn't be required by law already. They're meant to be targeted, those key integrity issues of additionality. All projects are subject to independent audits, typically 3 audits over the crediting periods, depending on their size. So there's a lot of things in there that kind of look good from the outside. Start scratching the surface, however, and things start to look a little ugly. Now, in order to understand what we're about to talk about, you have to understand this. This scheme is completely and utterly dominated by 3 project types. One called human-induced regeneration of even-age native forests. The next one, landfill gas. That's that Mugger Lane project I was talking about. So both of those together add up to 60% of the scheme, give or take. Then you add in avoided deforestation projects, which should, if you want the full name, it really should be avoided deforestation in far western New South Wales. They're over 20% of the scheme. And then, so that's 3. So you're hitting 80 odd with just, and you're in the top 3. And then you've got savanna burning in Northern Australia, which is about 11%, give or take again. So they completely dominate the scheme. The rest of the scheme is basically rats and mice from other project types, about 30 odd other project types. Now, let's just go to avoided deforestation, and I won't labour this because these projects are so silly that it's almost not worth talking about. But we've got Phil Gibbons here too, so he knows the history of this very, very well. Now, this method is, as I said, targeted to Western New South Wales. It's based on the assumption that landholders who went and got a clearing permit, a particular type of clearing permit, called an invasive native scrub property vegetation plan, an INS-PVP to use the lingo, that those farmers who got that permit would exercise it and clear all the land that's been approved within 15 years. When I say it like that, it sounds kind of reasonable, right? Why would somebody go out and get a clearing permit if they weren't going to action the permit? Thanks, but I won't because Phil's in his lunchtime and he shouldn't have to think in his lunchtime. The problem was that INS PVPs were very deliberately and massively over-allocated. They allocated clearing permits to the tune of 5 million hectares, so authorising the treatment of 5 million hectares. Now, not all of that constitutes deforestation of its action, but it's the treatment of 5 million hectares. In New South Wales, total clearing since the 80s has averaged, so total state clearing has averaged about, what, 16, 18, maybe 1,000 hectares a year. And remember, these INS PVPs are only for the clearing of remnant vegetation or pre-1983 regrowth. So it's old vegetation or fully intact. A lot of that total number includes reclearing. So start doing the maths in your head. Hold on. If there's that much land that's out there that was authorised for clearing, how on earth could they get through it in 15 years? When you do it and push it down a little bit more, the total area that is likely to be eligible under the method is, at an absolute minimum, 350,000 hectares. That's the total area that is now currently getting carbon credits for not clearing. The total area that's possibly eligible was somewhere near 700,000 hectares. Now, remember, that total area must have been cleared within 15 years. What does that look like? Well, it required the rate of clearing in Western New South Wales to jump up from its historic levels of about 2,000 hectares a year, and then jumped up to somewhere between 23 and 46,000 hectares a year and stay there for 15 years. Anyone think that that's possible? No. That's what it looks like in a graph. If you actually take the actual amount of clearing over the recent period, that's what it looks like. Again, does anybody think that that is possible? The minimum that we would have hit, almost 30,000 hectares of clearing in Western New South Wales and stayed there for 15 years in the counterfactual. How many times do you think that clearing across the entire state has got anywhere near that number? It's once or twice. Once or twice, and not since MC Hammer was a thing in the 80s. So it's just grossly unlikely. If you map it, it gets even better. I'm an economist by training, and I love adverse selection, right? It ruins so many markets. But if you want a visual representation of adverse selection at work, it just does not get any better. This is a map of New South Wales. These turquoise area here are the projects. The green area shows remnant uncleared vegetation. The white area showed cleared vegetation. What you'd expect of the projects, if things were working as you'd expect these turquoise areas to be over in the areas where you see frequent clearing. But where are they? They're out in the boonies where people barely ever clear. If they clear, they do it for fodder harvesting, which in this case is not eligible under the method, because if you do fodder harvesting, you're required by law in order to allow it to regrow. Because when you clear mulga, it tends to regrow because grazing doesn't tend to suppress it sufficiently to stop its regeneration. That's what the regulations are based on. So it looks like avoided deforestation is a stinker. It's very hard to think it's something else than a stinker. The Chubb review, when they reviewed it, didn't want to say it's a stinker, but they recommended that the method be revoked. It was. So this method has now been revoked. Problem: even though the method is revoked, these projects get to continue to generate credits until the end of their crediting period. So we currently still have avoided deforestation projects in the system. They're still getting about 20% or more of credits per year, and they'll continue to get credits through to 27, 28. There's a couple of projects that go into the 2030s. So I think we've both wasted money here and we're handing out carbon credits that have very low integrity and are likely simply facilitating increases in emissions. And that brings us to HIR, human-induced regeneration projects. Now, this method was originally intended to apply only to previously cleared land. So the idea is that land holes had gone out and knocked over vegetation, and then we offer them carbon credits to allow that vegetation to naturally regrow. It was made in tandem with another method, was for environmental plantings, when it involved actual planting of trees or seed. And these were two twin methods. They were explicitly meant to apply to cleared land. So that to me makes perfect sense. In some cases, you're going to have problems with natural regeneration. We all know that. Some cases, it just doesn't come back like you thought it was. The method provided for those circumstances. So the method itself, in my view, is not so bad. It can be actually, if it's applied well, it can be a very good method. The problem was it was introduced in January 2013 under the Labor government. There was one project in cleared lands on the Eyre Peninsula. There was a change of government in 2013, 2014, and they started a thing called the Emissions Reduction Fund, where they were running biannual auctions, and the government was very, very concerned about the fact that no one would turn up at their auctions. Mysteriously, at the same time, all of a sudden, the Clean Energy Regulator regulated a project out near Wenowing. Anyone know where Wenowing is? Far northwest, New South Wales, out in the boonies. That area is never been comprehensively cleared. There's a patch of it that has, but largely it's never been comprehensively cleared. And that was inexplicable. I was the chair of the committee at the time. We had no idea about this and we're not told about it. After that happened, months later, a few more projects rolled in. So I think we had 3 projects in 2014. Come 2015, this thing went off like a firecracker and spread all over the place. There's now 42 million hectares of these projects that are largely on uncleared land where they're purporting to regenerate and have been credited on the basis that they are regenerating even-aged native forests across the entire area that is being credited. Now, to me, I'm not an ecologist, but it confuses the hell out of me about the idea that you could add the equivalent of a new even-aged native forest in an area that has never been cleared, particularly where it contains substantial numbers of pre-existing mature trees and shrubs. Doesn't make a lot of sense. It's like taking your jug of water over here when it's full and continuing to pour water in it and thinking that the jug's going to hold the water. It just simply can't. That leads to a bunch of issues. Sorry, before I get to the bunch of issues, this is what projects were meant to look like for those who don't look at these parts much. This is a classically cleared bunch of paddocks out in Western New South Wales, not too far away from Bourke. They stand out really clearly. If you go and look at your Google Earth images, you can actually see where I've taken them from. This is what they were meant to look like at the start, and then they were meant to end up looking like that through time, through regeneration. When you look at most of the projects, that's what it looks like. This is actually a credited area back when the project started, and that's what it looks like now, which to me looks kind of the same. Now, I won't give you that. The problems with these projects, which probably for a lot of you are bleedingly obvious, but let me just lead you through them. Firstly, it's very improbable that you're likely to add significant amounts of biomass to these areas because they've never been cleared and the cup is at or near full. You're looking for some process that could conceivably substantially reduce the amount of biomass on site. What it is hypothesized by proponents and others is that grazing has that effect. That grazing can have an effect over that sort of area. Now, I've worked in this field and I've worked with this question for a long time. I've also worked with a lot of people whose one of their sole and primary research focuses is on the impact of grazing. What I both constantly read and constantly hear is grazing does not materially affect tree cover in uncleared areas. There are some exceptions, places like the Quilpie contrast that stand out, but they are exceptions, and they tend to be named because they are exceptions. Generally, grazing does not have that effect. It can slow the growth of young plants in regeneration events. Absolutely it can. But over extensive areas and over time, it tends not to have a material impact on biomass in uncleared areas. If anything, the literature suggests the opposite, that grazing is more likely to result in an increase in woody biomass than a decrease. That's by clearing out ground cover and thereby inhibiting fire and also freeing resources for young trees. Hence, the fact for 50 years, from 1950s, the series of La Nina events that occurred in the 1950s onwards, through to basically when carbon credits came about, the primary concern of natural resource management people and scientists was about the woody thickening phenomena that had been observed throughout Western New South Wales and over vast areas of Queensland. You can see this if you want. You can actually pick a lot of the imagery off the New South Wales Spatial Archive, and you can watch out in the area northwest of the Darling. You can actually watch it thickening through the latter part of the century. It's really clear. That is an area that was at the time heavily grazed by sheep. Those sheep apparently were meant to be suppressing that, but they weren't. So all the evidence that we have points to the fact that that mechanism couldn't possibly be having the sort of effect that has been claimed in these projects. The other thing is that these rangeland areas have very much a boom-bust ecology. They're talking about areas that receive less than 350, less than 300 mils average rainfall. So therefore, they're very sensitive to ups and downs in rainfall. We know that very clearly in terms of very large mulga death events that occurred in the Federation drought, and we've seen them again. We saw them again in the 2017 to 2019 drought in Western Queensland, a substantial mulga death event. So rainfall really matters. And you even watch the time series, the imagery that we have, you can actually see those impacts both on ground cover and in some cases on tree cover as well. Because you've got that natural variability through time, and sometimes the timescales here are actually really hard to get your head around. I originally was thinking you'd see, significant changes in 10, 15-year periods. When you look at the evidence, those fluctuations occur over centuries. So it's much harder to get your head around. But the key point here is because you've got that dynamism in woody cover, then it's hard to differentiate from the impacts of the project activities, controlling grazing, versus what is happening due to those natural fluctuations. So you can get you're falsely crediting increases in woody cover that are just due to rainfall. The final one here is measurement and overcrediting. All this wouldn't matter as much if people were required to go out and measure the biomass on the site, how much they've added, but they don't. They apply a model called FullCam. FullCam assumes the area is cleared or largely cleared, and you get growth up to a maximum amount that the site will contain under a native vegetation. So it's assuming across the entire area that's being credited that that is occurring. And unfortunately, that is not where these projects are, and that is not what is happening. These projects, most of the credited area had large amounts of mature trees and shrubs on them when they started. And because of the factors I discussed previously, we're not seeing that regeneration. And yet the credits keep flowing. If you want to see this amusingly, go and have a look what happened in Western Queensland in the 2017 to 2019 drought. Drought struck, and it struck hard in that part of Queensland. You could see the impacts, and even you talk to people in the communities, it was really well known. There was large tree death events happening. And yet these projects squirt, the carbon credits keep flowing despite the fact that the trees weren't growing. That's that issue. I'll kind of park that because I know I need a lot of time. To show you where the projects are, that shows you a map of where the projects are. Sorry about the green on it. That's the projects that we included in a study, but you get the idea. The area covered is enormous. The project area is the size of Iraq. We used to say the size of Japan, but it grew. It's about 5 million hectares larger than Japan. How silly is this got? Well, here's a bunch of projects in the dead heart of Australia. That is Hermannsburg, Alice Springs, so right on the border. Some of my absolute favourite projects. My real favourite, though, are those in the Nullarbor Plain. Because of those who did Latin, and I did do Latin, you'll know that that means no trees. Western Australia, we have searched and analysed most of these projects in detail. There's almost not a single project there that makes any sense at all. They are absolute and utter nonsense. There is no chance that those projects result in substantial increases in sequestration. We might see it in some areas, but by and large, that is great, simple evidence of a ginormous fraud. The idea that they're growing enormous amounts of even age native forests across that part of the country is just plain silly. Now, how are the projects going? How's my time going? It's probably the best, most important thing. Oh, I've got a bit of time. Good. Okay, so what I'm going to take you through down is analysis that my team and I have done. I'm going to start at the high level. So we're going to start using lower level databases comprised on the basis of lower level imagery, and then take you down into higher resolution imagery through time. So this was from a paper published in Communications, Earth and Environment, where we used a database called the National Forest and Sparse Woody Database. This is the database that the Australian government uses to compile the national accounts. One of the reasons, or there's two main reasons we started with this database, and one is that it's used to compile the national accounts. If it's not turning up here, it's not turning up in our national accounts. The purpose of the offset scheme is to basically accumulate abatement that we can count towards our international targets. So if it's not here, for policy purposes, it's not there. The second reason is that the Clean Energy Regulator commissioned two gentlemen to conduct an analysis of HRR projects based on the National Forest and Sparse Woody Database. They came out and declared and trumpeted with as much profile as they could attract, and they continue to do it to this day, that the analysis showed that the projects are having a statistically significant effect on woody cover, forest cover, and sparse woody cover. And that's it. Statistically significant effect on the levels of forest and sparse woody cover. What they forgot to mention was the effect size. So we went and looked at this in more detail to actually expose and look at that question. What we found is this. So this is when the projects are registered. That's the amount of forest cover. So plus 20%. That's 2022. This is sparse woody cover. So areas with between 5 and 19%. This is the area, the credited area in 182 projects that we analysed. So a small decrease in sparse woody cover and a small increase in forest cover. Is that consistent with even age natural regeneration across the entirety of that area? No, it's not. You expect to see a much clearer picture. Sorry about this. That's giving you the breakdown of what I've just shown you essentially. But what it breaks down to here is what we saw was out of the 182 projects, 70 of them had a significant decrease in cover. 73 had basically negligible, and 39 had a positive trend in woody cover. That's what it looks graphically. So here, what we also did, not just tracking what was happening in terms of the forest cover and woody cover inside the credited areas, we also compared that to the averages from 3 kilometre buffer zones around the projects, excluding other projects. This is the comparison area. This is the credited area. That's forest and their woody cover. So you can see strongly correlated through the time series. If these projects are working, you'd expect to see a divergence. When the projects are started, you haven't. What you've seen is tracking through time. We, funnily enough, found almost exactly what the Clean Energy Regulator's analysis found, that the projects had a statistically significant effect. It's just the effect size was very, very small and nowhere near commensurate with how the projects have been credited. This is to show you this in another way. This shows you forest cover, only forest cover, when the projects were registered across 180 through, box and whisker, and then this is what they were in 2022. And this shows you expected cover based on how they're credited. You'd expect forest cover somewhere around here when they start, and this is where they should be based on the number of credits that they've received. You can see a huge difference between the two. So that's the National Forest and Sparse Woody data set. Then we moved on to a data set called the Woody Cover Fraction data set. It's like the last one, it's Landsat based, so starts with 30 by 30 imagery, reshaped to 25 by 25. And we analysed the same thing, but a slightly different technique here. And I've got Maldwin the Wizard with me here as part of this. What we did here is we matched cells based on correlation prior to project starting. So we had 100 hectare cells, and then we matched each 100 hectare credited cell to a corresponding 100 hectare outside. And what we found was, well, firstly, tend to be kind of correlated. And then when you break it down and you run it through one of Baldwin's wizard models, this is what we found at the top. So there's two lines there. There's one for the credited areas and there's one for the comparison areas. Look closely and can you see there's a tiny divergence. Look on the y-axis and you'll see that it's a tiny difference that we're able to detect. So again, statistically significant, but very, very small. We did find at the project level, there's some projects where the effect size seem to be slightly larger, but when you go back to the actual real data, there seemed to be no correlation between how these projects are performing. Seeming in some cases their corresponding cells, the matched cells, were declining more. We weren't seeing a consistent, in terms of good performance, we weren't seeing them consistently increasing cover like you'd expect. So it doesn't seem to match. The last thing that we're working on now is a new analysis using Sentinel data. So we've gone from 30 by 30s now to 10 by 10s, because one of the claims made by many people is that, oh, you're just not seeing it. It's happening. It's definitely there. You just need to use higher resolution imagery. That's all the while pointing to that original National Forest and Sparse Woody analysis saying that shows that everything's fine. This is the results, hot off the press. We haven't even matched the cells yet. So we've gone to 10 hectare cells using 10 by 10 resolution data. This is 206 projects. Geez, I don't know about you guys, but that looks kind of correlated. Kind of. Again, you should see a divergence and you're not. They're very strongly correlated. It only goes back to 2017 because Sentinel-2 data only became available late 2016. But you get the picture. The data sets that we have that are based on the satellite imagery are telling us that these projects are achieving very little. So let's go down a level now. Let's use 2 meter and below. Most cases, the imagery you're about to see about 50 centimeters to 1.5 meter resolution. I've picked just a couple of illustrative projects. This is the Waroo project up near Hungerford, if people know Hungerford. They were up on the Queensland, New South Wales border. I've picked a selection of sites. Let's go through them. So this is before, just quickly noting, it was registered in 2015. These projects could backdate. There's a whole story around backdating. If that's not illegal, I'm not a lawyer, but let's just go and play with it. So this is about when the project started, picking that first area up here. So this is outside the project area, the credited area. This is inside the credited area. This is 2011. This is 2023 after the triple banger La Nina event. Can you see evidence of a material increase in woody cover? And can you see a material difference between what's happening inside and out the credited area? I can't. How about this one? This one is inside, outside. Again, 2016 to 2023. Similar thing again. For this project, it's important to note this project's received about 250,000 ACCUs. So it's received about $7.5–8 million, this project. And what you should have seen based on the level of crediting is about a 20% increase in crown cover. So we should see this gone a 20% expansion in the crowns. I'm sorry, it's just not there. Again, 2016, 2023, inside and out. Then they're not the same image. They're taken from different time periods. When we analyze these projects with a new Sentinel database, again, matching 2,000 randomly selected 10 hectare cells inside and looking to the credited areas, this is the match. And it's exactly what you'd expect to see if you'd spent the thousands and thousands and thousands of hours that my team and I have done looking at the raw imagery. It is just simply not happening. The evidence is not there that these projects are resulting in this regeneration. And the science suggests we wouldn't expect to see that happening. It'd be a shock if that was actually happening. Here's another project, the Kirrawina. This is a really good one that's complete. This white area here is our comparison area. Again, for these purposes, initially we took the whole area and compared it, and then we've been matching cells ever since. So here are the areas just really quickly. Similar, so starting up here. This is outside, this is inside. Before and after. Obviously a higher resolution image than up here, but again, we've looked at this image and we've looked at similar ones like it. Can't see any evidence of material increase in tree cover. This is again focused very much here. In this case, there's there's credit area all over this, but they tend to be pixelated because of the way that they did this. But if you just focus on this area, this is a full credited area, this band in here. So here and here, I can't see any difference there. And then I've just used a higher zoom level here. Sorry about that, still coming through. You can actually go through and match tree for tree across the images. So again, I mean, I could bore you. I could do this all day just because I get hypnotized by how much fun it is to look at these sorts of images. Here's a good one, inside and out. I can't see it. Sorry, the image is still coming through. And if it, I won't, because we're short on time. Here's one that has come through. This is the credited area here. Here's outside before and after. Again, I can't, it hasn't really come through, has it? Yeah, still easing its way through the system. These slides will be up for people who are interested. This is the Sentinel analysis based on that project as well. Again, it's kind of matching what we're seeing from the imagery, including the high resolution imagery. So that leads me to ask, how has this happened? Why did this happen? And I mean, clearly, firstly, there's some pretty bad stuff happening in my view. These are financial products. Financial products are subject to specific regulations to prevent people from being misled. Why? Because people put their hard-earned, their family savings into financial products. Superannuation funds put their hard-earned, our hard-earned, into financial products like this. In this case, there's quite a few pensioners who have their monies caught up in this stuff. OTPP, Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, that's teachers' pension plan. Anyone invest in ethical investment in Australia, Australian Ethical Invest, they've got money in this. There's quite a few others who have money tied up in this. So it's a serious issue. If we're correct, you start to ask how things have got this bad. My hypothesis is a simple political economy one. Both the previous government and the current government need a healthy supply of cheap ACCUs. In the absence of a healthy supply of cheap ACCUs, what happens? ACCU prices go which way? They go up. They go up significantly. If you crimped the supply of credits out of these projects, it would cause ACCU prices to soar. That would make the likes of the Santosses and Woodsides very, very unhappy because it costs them. It'd also potentially push some of the new projects into the space where they become uneconomic. The other thing it does, and this is an interesting twist, is that there's a cap price under the safeguard mechanism, set at $75 and then inflated at CPI. So, and what happens when you hit the cap price? Under normal emissions trading schemes, under normal pricing schemes, they simply work like a tax, that you hit the cap price and you have to just pay an amount. Yeah, nice and simple. Not under the safeguard mechanism. Under the safeguard mechanism, because the Labor government was scared to have to introduce a separate tax bill, what did they do? They made the cap price work by the Commonwealth selling ACCUs. So when the cap price binds, if they moved on this, the cap price might bind. If that happened and the Commonwealth didn't have enough ACCUs, it would have to enter the market and buy them at above the cap price and then sell them at the cap price. That's a sure way to go broke, i.e. buy high and sell low. Never a good way to make money. So that, if you ask me, that explains why we're in the situation that we are. Is that the government, it's not as if they don't know there's a problem, it's just that they don't want to act on it. And if you watch what they're doing right now, they are insisting that they continue to keep crediting flowing to the major projects. That's why they didn't stop crediting to avoided deforestation projects. That's why they proposed giving landfill gas projects their 4th crediting period to keep the credits flowing. And that's why they refuse to stop crediting and refuse to stop the issues that are happening here. And that's a good way to finish.
Oh, there are questions. Yes.
Thanks, Andrew. So if like HIR is only marginal at best, significant, but not 10% maybe of what it's supposed to do, then the price would have to go up by 10x or something, right? And
I'd be surprised if HIR was doing 10% of what it's been credited. I'd be surprised if it got above 5%. There are 18 good projects that we've identified, almost wholly in cleared land. It's not wholly, but predominantly. So
I guess that's what
there are. I mean, it's important to emphasize that. But yes, you're quite right. The prices would go very high.
So if we can, try to deal with the huge amount of environmental variability and incentivize people to do the right thing when they can, it's just that this total supply at this highest level will never be reached. And so I'm thinking about it from a producer's level. If you could, really incentivize people to do it right, the price would be so high that either the market would break or it would actually incentivize people to do the right thing. I mean, it would be cheaper to just mitigate.
There's a thing in monetary space. It's called Gresham's law. Basically, good currency chases bad currency chases out the good. And that's what we've got going on here is these bad projects, these low integrity projects, their abatement costs are really, really low. And if you're a good project, your costs are not really, really low. So these bad projects chase out the good by making it uneconomic to actually undertake those good projects. And we work with quite a few entities that are trying to do those good projects, particularly environmental planning projects. And we constantly encounter this. You run the financials and at carbon prices hovering at $30, $35. They just don't make sense. The prices have to be higher, or they have to change the profile of the credits, which the government hasn't been willing to do, i.e. shift them forward.
Well, I'm just trying to say, if there could be a high integrity credit, would the system still work? Because we're at sort of risk of blowing up the whole system.
Yeah, no, I think you're, if you just confined crediting to high integrity projects, prices would be very high and there'd be a political problem. And so I think the best thing to do, and I've said this right from the start, is just put a tax in, put a cap price in, collect the money, and then the government runs a more efficient scheme. The problem with good projects, they tend to be smaller. They're capital intensive. They require a lot of upfront capital, whereas your crediting looks like this. If the government ran a scheme, it can overcome that, can reduce the transaction costs, because a lot of the transaction costs are driven by the fact that the scheme is a private government scheme. You can get around that by internalizing a lot of those costs and doing things like systematic program-wide monitoring rather than monitoring every single project. So I think we could drastically reduce the transaction costs, but you have to get a government who's willing to introduce a tax bill to replace what they've currently got and to tackle the integrity problems that are in the scheme.
More questions? Just the guy in the front there.
But you're carrying around an esky, I was.
Yeah.
So what are the policy options to address integrity of the scheme right now, given the fact that people clearly know it's corrupt, it's unlawful, it's not working, and are in denial about it?
We've rung the bell as loud as we can, and we're hoping that someone turns up to address the problems. But the blunt policy response is just what I said. If a government was willing to act, they simply put in a cap price that gets the polluters off. I've spoken to most of the major polluters. When you say to them, would you accept a cap price set at 45, 50 bucks? They're like, fine, that provides us with certainty. And then we just have a CPI through time, fine. So that deals with them. But the problem now is this reflects back on the bureaucrats, politicians, and everybody else. So if this unravels, which I'm very sure it's going to unravel. It might not unravel now, but start looking at the weather. We're not in another triple La Nina event. When the landscape starts drying, it is going to be painfully obvious to everybody in the world that this ain't working. And then what does the government do then? That's what I'm interested in. Where does this end game? Because the government has dug itself into a hole. And by government, I mean the regulator, the departments, everybody.
Thanks for that. I think you mentioned the third large category was landfill gas.
Yeah.
Is that one all right, or is everything stuffed?
Stinker. Yeah. Here, I'll give you the upbeat story. Landfill gas is dominated. Our landfill sector is really concentrated. We have 20 landfills that account for more than 50% of our landfill waste. Mugger's one of them. It's about the 11th largest in the country. And you go around, you've got Eastern Creek, Lucas Heights, Woodlawn for Sydney. Then you've got a bunch in Melbourne Regional Landfill, Hallam, blah, blah, blah. They receive most of the waste. Those sites are really big. and they tend to be better managed, better regulated. They're subject to higher regulations. Those regulations require them to capture the gas already, right? Now, also, because they're large sites, they get a lot of gas. So it's more economic to put a generator on it. Remember, if you've got a generator, you get money for selling the electricity. You get money for selling LGCs, renewable energy certificates, and you also get ACCUs. So the key question for landfill gas projects is not whether they're combusting the gas, it's how many credits they get. And that's dictated by a thing called the baseline. And that's simply the percentage of the gas they capture, which they would have caught anyway, captured anyway. And the problem is those large projects were given preposterously low baselines on this. And we're meant to accept that those really large sites, some of them have 0% baselines. So they're trying to tell us that in the absence of carbon credits, those very large sites, typically located in urban areas that are highly regulated, where it's most economic to run the projects, wouldn't be capturing any gas. Now, that's obvious nonsense. Now, back in the Chubb review, all the major operators, accounting for over 90% of those projects, signed a letter with me to the government and to Chubb saying the baselines are broken and they need to be fixed. Have they been fixed? No, they haven't. They continue to get credits based on baselines from the early 2000s in most cases. Having said all that, there are about 50 small, so there's about 111, 112 landfill gas projects. About half of them are small sites with flares only. I don't have a beef for those projects. Most of them have baselines at 30%, i.e. the small projects have the highest baselines. Riddle me that one. And they're all, while a lot of them are regulated, they tend to be softly regulated. So 30% kind of makes sense. In some cases, might even be lower. So unfortunately, the short answer is what no, they're just not. They're really stupid. And the fact that the industry itself put its hand up and said our baselines are broken and the government still hasn't fixed it. I mean, I just can't explain that other than from what I said before. They just need the supply of credits. The funny one, Margaret Lane is a really good site if you're really interested. It's fascinating. They'll give you a great site visit. It's run by a company called LGI. They're good people. That baseline there is 66%. So their competitors have baselines at 0 or 24, and they've got a 66%, and they're making out like bandits. They're doing very well down there, just to show how silly the whole system is.
Unfortunately, we need to leave it there because the room is booked and required very soon. So just want to thank you. It's fascinating and profoundly disturbing all at the same time. So thanks very much for a great talk. Yep.